most of our clients are buying off the plan developments, and you're sort of doing buyers advocacy in the traditional housing market. How have you found it? Are we post-COVID or still in the middle of this market?
Look, I think the recovery has definitely begun.
Yep.
And I think that's going to accelerate for the rest of 2020 and into 2021. And even some of the banks have come out. Yesterday, HSBC came out and another bank said that next year we're going to see growth in Melbourne property prices of 14%. Now, that's
quite a contrast from the first comments.
Quite a contrast, and it's really, what has happened with COVID? There's been a pause, right? And that's all it has been is a pause. We've been constricted from being able to go about, particularly in real estate, and do our business. But the property fundamentals, essentially remain the same. We've got low interest rates. We've got a supply of property is very short, and the banks want to lend money now. It's easier to get a loan than what it was after the Royal Commission. So we have all these conditions, and not to say without saying the stimulus that both the state and federal government have put forward. It makes property, all those conditions, the fundamentals are so strong. So it's only natural that property is going to really take off, I think, in the next couple of years.
Yeah, totally. Completely can see how that's happening. Cool. I think that's a good,
Great.
really good opening one.
Yeah. Do another take, or that's it?
No, I think that was great. I was actually really interested. I might ask another question about what you'd advise people getting into the property market. Is that something you...
Yeah.
So maybe how you started.
Yeah, okay.
Cool. So Greville, how would you advise a millennial now? Obviously, you've got years of experience in real estate, and you obviously got your own portfolio. Somebody starting off that wants to live in Melbourne, what's the best way to get into the market?
Okay, so there's lots of choice when you buy property, and property is now far more complex than when I, and even you, when we started to go out and buy property. And there's lots of mistakes that people can make, particularly young people. And I think the most important thing that young people can do when they buy property is simply to get advice, independent advice from somebody outside of the transaction. So if you're buying a property, why on earth will you listen to what the vendor's agent tells you, right? They're paid by the agent's paid by the vendor, right? As soon as you walk into the property, the agent, his job or her job is
to sell you.
Is to sell you and for you to be their best friend, right? And that's what happens. And so it's really important to get independent advice. It's really important for first home buyers to do their homework. And it's really important for them to buy the right property, and there's a whole segment that we can talk about, how to select the right property. But it's a bit like, you have choices, right? You buy a very good property as a young person, that can set you up for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
It can be the difference between, going on a nice holiday every year, or not, or having your children in, a good private school or not.
Yeah. So who do you get the advice? So say I'm starting out, I'm 25, I've got some cash together, maybe some money coming in from somewhere else, from the folks or whatnot. Who would I go to seek that independent advice? Because I know you do buyers advocacy. Would that be somebody that you'd say?
Yeah,
you're involved in the transaction, but you're sort of not.
I think somebody with experience, somebody that, a valuer, someone with experience, a buyer's agent, but you need to do your homework there, like with anything. You need to look at their track record, how long have they been in the industry, what have they bought, what are their stories, before you select that, and look at some of the organisations, the professional organisations, are they members of those organisations, are they fully licensed, and all of those, you need to do all those checks like with anything. But yeah, that's very important when you're buying, because it's a big decision, for a young person when they're buying their first home or It's the biggest investment many people will make in their lives. And, it's very similar when we go and buy a car, right? We just bought a car for my youngest son. And, I don't know anything about cars. So, do I just go and blindly go and buy a car and take a risk, or do I get the RACV, or I've got a mate who's a mechanic who came around and checked it out for me? And otherwise, I don't know what's under the bonnet. It's the same with property. You don't know what's under the bonnet. And I've seen some horrendous mistakes that set young people back years and years, and some of them never recover.
Well, I was almost one of those people. I think I was quite lucky. In my first property I bought, I didn't listen to anyone. I bought an apartment in Elwood because I wanted to live in Elwood. And I was lucky I sold it at the peak of 2017. So actually was still lucky to make a little bit of money. But, looking back on what that property's worth now, 5-6 years later, it's actually probably worth less than what it was then. So I learned a lot from that transaction.
Yeah, it's it is. It's amazing. And I look at when I'm investing in property, and I've been investing in property for 30 years. Now I look at we look at cars. Okay, so you look at collectible cars, and you look at why 1950s air-cooled Porsches and 911s. Why do they appreciate so much? I know we've both got an interest in contemporary art, right? And it's the same thing. You look at the artist, you look at their work, you look at have they got international exposure? There's a whole bunch of things we look at. The same thing. It's with whatever it is, whatever you collect these days. When I was a kid, people collected stamps and coins, and that's probably changed now. But it's about property is no different to that. It's about collecting a scarce asset, not a homogenous one, right? Where you might go out to an estate, and every house is the same. The only difference being the colour of the door. Right. Those sorts of properties, the scarce assets are the ones that drive value. Whether, as I said before, about cars or other artifacts or whatever.
So if you're in the market to purchase property and you've got a decent capacity to look at a more scarce asset, when you're talking about art, international artists, they've done exhibitions at XY Gallery. What would be the criteria as a Melburnian, Victorian period home locations? What can you tick off? The things that you like when you're looking for property?
Look, I'm looking at, through my lens, I'm looking at probably a much wider lens and a longer list of things and attributes that I'm looking at, because I know through experience what drives value and what doesn't. So, I'm looking at the continuity. I'm looking at the street. I'm looking at one side of the street, maybe one end of the street. I'm looking at the continuity of housing styles in that street. I want to see a continuity of architectural style. I don't want to see, real mixed sort of use.
Why is that important?
I just think that consistency of an architectural style in the street is, it underpins value. And I think it's just nice. Right. And I'm looking at a bunch of other attributes. I'm looking at floor plan. Right? I'm looking at orientation. I want to see
north facing.
I want to see a north facing backyard, and many people don't understand what that is, right? But it's just that
some people think north facing is on the front of the facade. Because you're spending most of your time when you're living in your outdoors, so that's essentially where you want it.
You want all the sun where you're spending most of your, and this is where things have changed. Nowadays, people living, there's a big box out the back with a kitchen living family where we spend all of our time, and we have our fresco area, so we want to have the most light in that room. And now, if you look at, particularly in Melbourne in winter, the sunset's lower in the sky. I mean, you can get dark if you've got the wrong orientation. So, I'm looking at that. I may be looking at an easterly, as an easterly backyard as well. We get the morning sun. But I'm sort of probably passing, if I'm getting a southerly, south-facing backyard or west-facing. And I'm looking at where the rooms orientate to that direction. So if I've got bedrooms facing west, no one wants to sleep in a hot bed, right? So
Right.
these sorts of things are really important. And funnily enough, these are the factors that drive property value. And if you get it wrong, those properties don't perform as well as properties that do.
So you're really going into much finer detail, because I know for me, when I've looked at, and you've been showing me some property of late, I don't really look at the street. I look at the location, I like the area, then I'm going straight into the house. So definitely looking at the street looks like an important aspect. But I mean, what other things can you fundamentally go wrong? I mean, what should we be doing? Inspections? Like, should we have conveyances going through contracts? I mean, what other legalities or structural things should we be looking at with these types of homes?
Yeah, look, I always have a bit of a dad's look, right? Perhaps some people laugh when I say that, right? But I have a dad's look. I walk through with my client, and I point out things. It's a timber house. I go and check out the timber window frames. Are they rotted? Have they got white ants in them? I'm no building expert, but I know when I can see a defect or not.
Yeah.
What are the floors like? Are the floors, the high point in the room is going to be where the fireplace is. But from there you can see where the stumps are gone, and there's a fall in the floors. You can see cracks. I might see dampness in the walls. I look at the capping on the roof. Are there any cracks in there? I look at gutters. Do they need repair? So I'm looking at general level of repair. And if I'm unsure, I always recommend, before you buy something, it's like for a very cost-effective amount of money, get a building inspection report. I get one every time I buy a property for a client, and it's like $660.
Yeah.
And
I get
a 100-page report. And it's with photos, and something goes wrong, I've got a bit of a comeback.
You're also one of the founders of WBB, one of the biggest valuation companies in Australia. How is the valuations going in this current climate?
Yeah, I think it's been very difficult for a lot of valuers out there, because valuers rely on evidence and sales, and so when the real estate market shuts down and there's no transaction, and valuers rely on sales that have happened 3 months, 6 months prior. It becomes difficult when there's no sales evidence, clearly.
But is that coming into consideration? Because there's clearly no sales because you're not allowed to sell.
Yeah.
So does the asset hold its value, or is it being diminished?
During COVID, or?
Yeah.
We've seen some falls in value, but the value, the falls in value haven't been as much as what I would have expected. So during COVID, median house prices fell by 7-8%. Now, it just shows you how resilient the market is. And what I spoke about before, these property fundamentals are so strong in Melbourne that it's really underpinned the market as a whole. So we haven't seen great falls in value. And I think, when we talk valuation, it comes down, again, to some of the things I've been talking about, the attributes that drive value. And, some properties that you buy will basically fall in value from day one. And I look at property as every property has its own DNA almost, right? Some properties will go backwards when you buy it. Other properties will perform at 1% per annum compound for its whole life. There are reasons for that. But I'm out there for my clients, I'm trying to find properties that compound annually at 7% per annum. Now, if they do that, property doubles every 10 years if you compound at 7% per annum.
Is there particular areas that you can make reference to, regardless of spend or budget? Is there pockets in, you're Melbourne focused?
Yeah.
What would you say?
Look, I think the question, it's a good question. For young people, like the first option is always a house, if you can afford a house. Within, say, 10 kilometres, 15 kilometres of the Melbourne CBD. If you can't find a house, or maybe look at half a house, semi-detached house, maisonette, something like that. If you can't afford that, right, you go to a townhouse. If you can't afford a townhouse, then you go to an apartment. Generally I'll select an older style apartment. I'll select something that
like
has
an Art Deco.
there's something like an Art Deco in some of the best streets in Elwood that the area in Elwood that I like is that area between Marine Parade and Ormond Road, where all the cafes and shops and restaurants and Jimmy Jams and all those places. The Paris Centre of Elwood, right? But where you can walk out your front door, put a towel over your shoulder, walk down to the beach, or you can come, you walk another 50 metres the other way, and you can go and grab a great coffee, or go down to the Blue Tongue where have a beer or wine, and like it's.
So these locations and that structural build over a long period of time is obviously outperforming other things, right? So
look, they do, and it does come down to the street. So those streets in Elwood that I'm referring to, look at Beach Avenue, Pine, Kingsley, Bendigo Street, all of those, all those streets down there. There's the other area, off the other village, Addison Street, Tennyson Street. All of those streets are just, really, they've shown a really good history of growth. But they're older style, low density blocks. 8, 10, 12 in a block.
What are your thoughts on, obviously, we both have a property out in the Otway district. What do you think about not so much regional Victoria, but say you're buying your next property, looking at buying a lifestyle property and Airbnb-ing it out. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know. Look at Airbnb. It's interesting. I don't know how that's going to go. There a lot of those short-term stays are now being, converted to long-term permanent. And that's flooding the rental market. So at the moment, the rental market's very soft. When is it going to come back at some point? You'd hope so, but. That sort of choice, I think lifestyle property is lifestyle.
Are more people going to move and live in regional areas, and will that factor in some good times for investing for growth?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think about that, and I think areas like Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong, Kyneton, Macedon. Those areas are really lifestyle driven. There has been a shift. There's certainly been a rush to get out of Melbourne and go to those regional, partly because of affordability
and employment. There's a bit of employment.
There's certainly some employment going to Geelong and those areas. But longer term, will it outperform the Melbourne metropolitan area? I don't think it will. I think it's more of a short term, maybe 2-3 year thing. But once things start to get back to normal again, Melbourne will always outperform the regional area, and history has shown that over the last 40 to 50 years. Traditionally, those regional areas have only grown at 5% per annum. We're having a spurt now. But I think it will revert back.
Do you think that for somebody that's only got a budget of 600,000, there's not much you can get in Melbourne, is there?
No.
So that might change. Might have to make people make alternatives.
The price point is something. It's an important thing to raise, right? So, for me, unless you have a minimum of 450, and that's getting pretty hard, $450,000 will buy you a reasonable 1-bedroom flat in a good suburb in Melbourne. Anything less than that's very hard. 2 bedrooms really in Melbourne, start at about $650 to get a good one. Look, there's plenty of 2 bedrooms that you can buy for $500,000, but they're not good, right? So you either have to have $450, $500 to buy a 1 bedroom. I'm trying to find a 1 bedroom for a client at the moment, and they've got $550, and I'm struggling to find a good 1 bedroom for $550, because size is important when you're buying 1 bedrooms. You need to be over 50 square meters. So it's hard, and so
is that for the banking side of things?
That's for the banking side of things. So the banks won't lend on, if you're less than, some banks won't lend if you're less than 50 square meters. But can you buy a house? You can't buy a house in Melbourne, really. So, the areas that most people want to live, and where you want to invest. Like South Yarra is like entry levels 1.5, and you need to do work to it. Richmond, I've got a lot of clients that want to buy in Richmond at the moment, but again, we need to be careful in Richmond. Like you need to be, for me, I don't want to take my client outside of a grid, between north of Swan Street, south of Bridge.
Yep.
Between Punt and probably as east of no more further east than say Burnley.
Yep.
And that's an area known as Richmond Hill. So has strong capital growth, but if you're looking for a house in that area, unrenovated, you're looking at even a townhouse like starts at about 1.3, 1.4.
Yep.
For a townhouse, and a house you're looking at probably 1.4, 1.5 entry level. So when we go Bayside, Albert Park, Middle Park, St Kilda West, it's like entry level's probably 1.8 to 2. So
it's quite expensive.
It's quite expensive. So where do you go? So I agree. We can go to Belmont, Geelong. We can go, Newtown.
Do you think the market? I mean, a lot of people say this to me when we're talking about investing in real estate, and people aren't from a property background. They'll say it just can't continue to keep growing. Is there any? Do you have anything that's any weight?
Michael, people have been saying that to me since I was a young boy, right? Property prices aren't going to keep going, but they do. And we look at, Melbourne and Sydney are international cities. And if you compare, if you're sitting in Southeast Asia, right, and you look at, let's say you're sitting in Singapore, or or Jakarta or KL, right, and you're looking at prices in Australia compared to to prices there, it's like our property's cheap. Our property is incredibly cheap. You just can't you can't buy a larger.
Compare us to international
we
cities.
have to, right? We have to, and we look at London, we look at New York, we look at Toronto. We're an international city, so our I think we're undervalued. We're still undervalued when you compare it to those cities. We're undervalued, and it's going to continue to go forward, and prices in the inner city areas of Melbourne and Sydney are going to continue to grow. Like it's because there's a scarcity, and as world cities, Melbourne is going to become more of a rental city, just as other international cities in the world are. Most people can't afford to buy a house in London, in inner city London, right? It's like looking at a minimum of $6 to $8 million just to buy a little cottage in London, right? So you can buy a cottage, 4 kilometres from the Melbourne CBD in Albert Park for like $2 million.
Yeah.
Right. So it's actually cheap compared to some of these international cities.
Makes sense.